a stance against some of the religious organizations. So there was some splitting of these different anti-slavery groups. But in Leesville, they're having a big meeting with the Liberty Party. The notice for the meeting stating, "Is it not time for the abolitionists to arouse themselves?" There was like over 1,000 people showing up at this meeting. And they said if the Democrats came and they were supposed to have a meeting, there wouldn't be enough of them to raise a hickory pole, because a hickory pole was a symbol for the Democrats. And they said there wouldn't be enough of them that showed up to raise the hickory pole. And so the Leesville area was very much in the abolitionist ranks. So our two agents of the Underground Railroad, the one on the right is a picture of Abel Brown being beaten at one of his preaching places. The leaders in the movement in the Northeast, Charles Torrey died in 1846 and Abel Brown in 44, both in their 30s. You know, you hear about the Methodist Circuit Riders wearing out, you know, the same thing happened with these guys, except Charles Torrey irritated the wrong people down south, got thrown in jail, and died in prison. Since they are going to be inactive, we've got John D. Lawyer picking up the case here along with James Marinas, and they form a Christian anti-slavery society since the Northeastern one has lost their leaders. So they formed this group with the idea of reaching out to all the Christian churches in New York State to join them. The two reports by the anti-slavery agents, Reverend Cross and Brown, were written in Quaker Street. Quaker Street, of course, is named because there's Quakers there. The New York Yearly Meeting of Religious Society Friends, otherwise known as the Quakers, stated in their bicentennial booklet in 1895, "The future impartial historian seeking the original source of the influence which finally wrought the overthrow of slavery will find its beginning in the conscious moving against the great wrong within the body of the Society of Friends, in obedience to the teachings of simple spiritual truth, the practical recognition of the fatherhood of God and the brotherhood of man." So you're going to probably find activities where there's Quakers, okay? So here we are. This is a history of Albany and Schenectady counties, written in 1886. You're looking at the Quaker Meeting House, which still stands, built in 1807 in Quaker Street. Ebenezer Wright of Quaker Street was in earnest support of the Abolitionist Party, in which John Sheldon, James Sheldon, Reuben Briggs acted as agents for the Underground Railroad, assisting fleeing slaves on their way to Canada and freedom. That's according to that history book. So we've got something left behind, right? In the book entitled "The Story of the Friends Meeting House" at Quaker Street, Marjorie Hogue Phillips wrote in 44, they made their way here from previous harbors around Queens. Now Queens is on the Hudson River. So the slaves would have come up through the Hudson River, Queens, gone across the county to Rensselaerville, Livingstonville, then probably up north, or they went directly north to Quaker Street, where the Quakers would have held them, looking for the next Quaker location. This is a building in Queens that is considered to be one of the stations on the Underground Railroad. It's a historic building and faces the river. And so I guess that's a clue. In other words, they came up the riverbank, and some of them had tunnels that went from the house out to the riverbank so they could come in through that way. This is in Quaker Street. Skinner's house is one of the oldest houses. It's a plank house. I think Boss Jones might have built plank houses. It was part of the Underground Railroad. The slaves were hidden in secret places in the houses and were transported by being put in wagons and covered over with hay. They came from Queens, and the next regular stop was north of Esperance on their way to Canada. Now, north of Esperance is Charleston, Four Corners, where there was another Quaker meeting. So they went from one Quaker meeting to another, but there were also other places where they went. This is the Gingerbread House in Route 162 near Charleston, Four Corners. That is claimed to be also a part of the Underground Railroad. If you continue on, you'll get to Spraker's Basin, where the Erie Canal comes through. This is the Friends Meeting sign in Charleston, Four Corners. That's all that remains is a cemetery and the state marker. There's no meeting house there anymore. If they continued on, they might have gotten to Palatine Bridge, of the Fort Fry. You may have heard of that historic fort in Palatine Bridge from early, I think 1730s, something like that. They later on built this big granite house here. And John Fry was an officer in the New York State Anti-Slavery Society. And they're pretty sure that this house was on the Underground Railroad. And I was able to get a tour of it. Down in the basement, you can see the opening to the right that leads out. Supposedly there was a tunnel connected that went out to the bank of the creek, you know, I think the Mohawk River, the canal is right behind this house. I went in there, but it doesn't go anywhere. It ends at a wall, so I don't know. I mean, that's what they're thinking. John Fry came over from Switzerland, and the family originally came over from Switzerland in 1688, and they had a location pass for the Schoharie Creek in 1688, so they settled along the Schoharie in 1688 in that area, but they didn't like it, so they moved to where they were in Montgomery County. And this fireplace mantle is in the house, and basically it's a bicentennial mantle. It's from 1888. And it celebrates the families leaving Switzerland, come the United States.
What kind of wood is that?
I don't know the wood, but it's you can see the color. That's the way it looks today. But it's just interesting to see that he was, you know, because I think the family name means something a little bit different. It's spelled a little different than what that mantelpiece is. But that mantelpiece translated to IM3. This is the Peter Groman house right down here, you know, near the bridge. According to the History of Schenectady and Albany Counties, published in 1886, after it gets done talking about the Quakers in Quaker Street, it says the next station west was the house of Mr. Griggs, a miller at Schoharie. Mr. Griggs was born in Esperance, eventually bought a farm on Cripplebush Road, and operated the ferry across the Schoharie Creek. How many people know there was a ferry across the Schoharie Creek? There was a ferry that operated across the Schoharie Creek at Sloansville, where the bridge is there, that goes towards the pumpkin patch and all that. That was called the ferry road originally. Now it's called Junction Road because the railroad came through. But originally it was called the ferry road because there was a ferry that ran across the Schoharie Creek there, and Mr. Griggs was operating it before he moved here. So basically they're saying that he was an agent on the Underground Road. I think Griggs also ran for town supervisor in 1846, somewhere in that neighborhood. 1845 it must have been, 45 against John S. Brown of Sloansville. He lost to John S. Brown. John S. Brown was kind of unique. He was a sheriff during the anti-rent war and became the supervisor of the town of Esperance. So he lived in the same house and became supervisor of two different towns. So this house here,
You said Cripplebush?
yes, where Earl Berg lives, that was where Mr. Griggs lived.
Oh, my God.
And that's supposed to be the first farm owned by a black family, by the way, is that farm on Cripplebush Road. As you go, it's on your left, the house is on the left, and the barns are on the right. It's the first real farm that you come to on the Cripplebush. This is a picture, of course, this is John Wilkinson's take on the Groman house. Gives you an idea. The creek went through there, and there was mills located there. So here you've got the fort, not far from where there is supposedly underground activity, right there.
Hide in plain sight. They're hiding in plain sight.
Right. Yes. Possible routes that went through Schoharie County. Cooperation between Rensselaerville and Livingstonville, if you follow the Lunenburg Turnpike. The route of the Frankian churches and location of the Anti-Slavery Society meetings leading to Sharon seemed like another likely route, although not documented, going from Rensselaerville to Livingstonville to Richmondville to Sharon. Before 1850, you would not be surprised to see freedom seekers settle the existing black population of the county. has noted Schoharie County had more blacks than any county west of the Hudson River counties. So a gentleman by the name of Becker, who was an attorney, wrote an article that was a speech he gave to the Agricultural Society, where he talked about the state of slavery and the blacks in Schoharie County. What happened was if you read those articles about what the status of the blacks were in Schoharie County, they said they were better off as slaves than they were as free people because no one would give them work. You know, they didn't have sustenance. They were, victims of intemperance and all these things. So they made it sound like they had a pretty poor life after they were freed in 1827. This is a map that shows the different areas we talked about today. Here's Leesville, there's Charleston Four Corners, Quaker Street, Schoharie, Franklinton, Livingstonville, Rensselaerville, and Queensland's Landing over there. And here's Jefferson over here. And I think that's it. Yes.
You mentioned that 1827 was the cutoff for slavery in New York, but I'm curious as to, was that strictly enforced or was it just loose? Because I've read wills written in the 1830s that turned slaves over to their heirs. So I'm wondering, like, what your take is on that.
Yeah, they would have been freed by law by July 4th, 1827. There were some exceptions. I think they changed the laws, but if you brought slaves with you, okay, if you're traveling through New York, there were some rules, but a lot of times, slaves would take advantage of the fact of being in a free state and buy, and try
Would
to
it have been
disappear.
different in Westchester? Because I know this family that I investigated, they were there, since the early period, and still in the wills I see slaves that have been.
Well, at the time they made out the will, it could have been before 1827. The will could have been written before the law was
It
passed.
wasn't, so I guess I wonder, what would happen there, some kind of difference there.
Yeah, they wouldn't have had anybody there that would have been, living there as a slave. They still had, what do they call them, indentured servants.
Yeah.
And some signed contracts. A lot of, like I said, what happened according to what the people said at the time is the Yankees sold their slaves before 1827, where the Dutch kept them. And that's why you see them, they built a lot of little houses for them. That's why in Schoharie had old cabins. They stayed on the farms where they were. They didn't have a lot of options either.
Sure.
You know what I mean? And it wasn't until industrial development, like Amsterdam factories or things like that, where did they all go? In other words, we had hundreds of black people here in Schoharie. Where are they today?
Yeah.
And where did they go? And basically you'll find that, for one, they weren't welcomed. In other words, the KKK was active. There were other things that were going on that made it uncomfortable for them to stay, but then there was lack of employment, except seasonal, to work on the farms. What are they doing the rest of the year? Haulers of water and hewers of wood, that kind of thing. But so a lot of them went, where there was employment, like Amsterdam factories, Schenectady. And then some went to where there was agricultural pursuits.